Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today as part two of our January series by Paul of the Sirius report. We are going to dive into commodities today. Just to date stamp it, it is Monday, the 26th of January. It's just gone 9:15 Eastern. And just for a couple of price points, we have gold at $5,072. I have silver roaring away at $110 as well. So again, between us recording and you listening to this, hopefully there's been no wild swings in prices, but we shall see. All of that being said, Paul, welcome back, and ready to talk commodities.
Yeah, pleasure as ever, and thanks for having me.
Really looking forward to this. Let's start with silver then. And I know that you've recently released a video on YouTube. I'll link to this. I recommend that people watch it. You know, we were just talking off air. You were talking a lot about industrial demand and why hitting $100 really shouldn't have been a surprise, and why it's got a lot of room to run. And that's just based on the industrial demand. So I'll let you play with that sentence and however you want, and yeah, why you're not surprised and where it's going.
Yeah, look, I kind of originally was asked back in probably 2013 because we'd gone through the spell of the recent, well, in 2011, the record high for silver and for gold, and the price was obviously had sharply fallen away, and people were going, well, what's going to drive the price northwards again? And I always made the point it won't happen until the West is effectively drained. And we'll talk about just silver in this context, but
Mhm.
the same methodology applies to gold. And said that what will happen is when the West is effectively drained of silver, then you will see true price discovery. And what I meant by that was it wasn't like, as I've said before, literally every ounce of silver in the West is gone. It just means the available silver is no longer there.
Mhm.
And what we've seen in recent months, and it's starting to become quite acute, is previously for many years, whilst people took out silver contracts at, say, the COMEX, they very rarely stood for delivery. They would often could roll it over or want just a cash settlement. But then in recent months, and I would say probably going back to the middle or so of last year, there started to be an increased demand for physical delivery. Now, whilst we can't absolutely nail down the issue of how much physical metal exists compared to the number of paper contracts effectively, there's a lot of speculation. It's 300 to 1. If it's 300 to 1, fine. If it's not, maybe it's 200. The point is that in principle, there's 300 ounces of paper for 1 ounce of physical. Now, whilst nobody particularly is seeking to have physical delivery, it's not a problem.
Mhm.
Where it becomes a problem is when suddenly there is enormous demand for physical delivery. And we've seen, I think in December this year, there was, I think, 35 million. I think for January, there's 45 million. That's not even a normal contract month. March is still okay, some way off. And the last I knew, I think the open interest was, I can't remember, I think in total it came to something like 600 million ounces. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to stand for delivery, and the numbers may have changed, but it's significant. And the argument is, well, if a huge percentage were to stand for delivery, how is the COMEX going to be able to satisfy those delivery requests? And if they can't, then effectively they're in default. Now, I'm not saying, we have to be very clear here, that they are going to default, but the risk is growing. And therefore, on that basis, you can start to use my analogy that the West is drained of metal. Now, I know the COMEX is not the only source, of course,
Mhm.
potentially, but it's a good barometer that says, well, if the physical demand way outstrips the supply, then something has to be done. Either you have to source huge amounts more silver, which is very difficult to do because, contrary to a lot of perspectives or perceptions, there is significant global shortages. I mean, not that long ago, Shanghai had a 10-year low in terms of their inventory. So this is not a Western problem per se, but the issue is if you don't have the physical, then what you've got to try and do in some capacity is shake people out. So they, either actually increasing the margins, which they
Mhm.
did, to try and shake people out, or, the price becomes very volatile in the hope of shaking longs out who may stand for delivery. Now, there was a time when that used to be pretty successful and worked, but we've seen in recent months that that just doesn't work anymore. So a good example is when the price went to 54, which was at the time a new all-time high. And then the price fell back, I think, to about 44. And people going, oh, it's all going all the way back. And then it went north again, past the all-time high of 54. And this kept happening where you'll see time when the price falls back and then it doesn't resolve the problem. In fact, all it did was encourage more participants at the COMEX, for example, and more investors uh, standing for delivery. So, in fact, rather than resolving the problem, it made the problem significantly worse. And this is why, on that basis, eventually you get to the point where if you think you can smash the price and flush people out and it doesn't work, well, as should happen in the world of true price discovery, you have to find a point where the supply will satisfy demand.
Mm.
The problem they seem to be having is that's still not working. Now, therefore, as of you said, Rob, it's about $110 dollars per ounce. Now, I don't make price predictions because that's not what I do. I'm not interested in making price predictions. What I would say is for silver, you have to find that equilibrium. So we have true price discovery where eventually we can reach a point where the demand can be met by supply because people will then say, okay, I'm prepared to sell at this price. And then you start to replenish inventories. It might not be something that's easy to do, and it could take weeks, it could take months, it might take longer. No one's in a position to know that. But that for me is why we've reached this point where, silver obviously exceeded the previous all-time high, and people went, oh, well, that's it now. It's going to go back down. And I said, I posted on X going, this is merely a, we're on a journey, and we are on a journey. And therefore 50 wasn't the end of the matter. And people say, well, how you say you don't deal with prices. I don't, but I never believed in the past that silver would not reach 50 and exceed 50. Of course, it subsequently keeps going north. There's no guarantees that will happen in the future.
Mm.
So, again, we're not here to give people investment advice. We're just pointing out factual developments based on what my original assertion would have been, which was back in 2013. And of course, has proved to be the case. Now, the question, therefore, is why do people keep being told things like, well, silver is in a bubble. It's a double top. My Bollinger Bands on my indicate to me that, silver's overbought. This is all meaningless nonsense because the issue in hand now is physical supply and demand. Now, you can't have overbought physical silver. You can't have a double top for physical silver.
Mhm.
You can't be drawing Bollinger Bands and claiming that relates to physical silver. You can't have overbought physical. So the list goes on. None of this applies. And the problem is people have been sucked into this world of financialization where everything relates to this illusionary asset prices, illusionary world that isn't based on physical supply and demand. Whether, and that you can even apply that outside of commodities and look at equities and go, well, is that equity fair value? And
Mhm.
often it's not. Often it's in a bubble. And we've just created asset bubbles everywhere, meaning this has no basis in reality. Now, for me, the irony is that gold and silver were not in bubbles. They were actually significantly underpriced on the basis of physical reality, the physical demand and physical supply. So, inevitably, at some point, we were going to see a situation because industrially silver is massively in demand and it's increasing. The AI revolution, in inverted commas, which is debatable, requires huge amounts of silver because people perhaps don't realize, but as one example, every semiconductor contains a small component of silver. Silver's everywhere, and it's used industrially, not just in solar panels or electric vehicles, but the list is endless, and I've discussed that everywhere else, so I'm not going to repeat that. But you can go and listen to podcasts that have done about this with silver and discuss that at length. The industrial requirements is enormous. And you've got to bear in mind as well, that's only going to increase in the future because India is a great example. In the last 5 years, as well as China, they've been importing enormous amounts of silver, which creates silver shortages. And there's going to be, Africa's going to start wanting silver. So silver demand is going to increase and the silver supply is not increasing, which is why we've had this deficit between annual consumption demand versus supply. And that is going to continue for the foreseeable future because silver mines are quite rare. You have silver as a byproduct of copper and zinc mining, but typically there is not huge amounts of new silver mines or silver prospects globally. And I knew this because in the past, when I was involved in mergers and acquisitions of mining companies, we scoured the world looking for silver. It's very difficult to find things. So the question is, where does the supply come from in the future? Now, the argument is, can we recycle more? And I think we are starting to see recycling happening, for example, in China. The argument is when the price gets higher, it makes it more economically viable to do so.
Mm.
So, in essence, that's why the price is doing what it's doing. And applying technical analysis and drawing lines on charts and claiming things, this is overbought, etc., is meaningless because that has, as I said, nothing to do with physical demand and supply. That is what is driving the price, which is why all these charts are screaming one thing and reality is telling us something else. And that's what we're at this point in time. As things stand, physical reality, meaning supply and demand, is what is driving the silver price. And of course, there are other factors in this, including China restricting exports of silver that came into force on the 1st of January, as one example, which means compared to 2025, when they exported 5,000 ounces, they are not going to export anywhere near 5,000 ounces, which then therefore means other places in the world in the future are going to be materially short by whatever amount they don't export. They're not going to completely ban all exports, but we've also got to bear in mind that China gets an awful lot of silver from Russia.
Mhm.
That will continue. So there's an argument the global South countries will look after themselves, but the issue of Western countries is very much up in the air. So I think, in a broad sense, that's where we are with silver and why we're seeing what we're seeing. And no, it's no surprise for me to see silver doing what it's doing. Some may argue it's taken longer than they thought, but for me, it was always a matter of time. And you just therefore had to be patient and wait for the inevitability. Because if you understand silver production, you understand silver demand, then you know eventually, particularly as we've been in deficit for 5 years and will be this year, there was always going to come a breaking point where the paper manipulation, the illusion would have to give way to physical reality. And we seem to be there. And the reason I say seem to be there is I'm not going to say there isn't a chance, something may happen in the future to try and drive the price down. But I'm not here to make price predictions
Mhm.
or tell you which way the price will go because I don't deal on that basis. What I deal with is the objective realities of what's happening. And as things stand, that is happening. But maybe in a month or two, the supply drought will resolve itself. Then we'll see what happens. But if it doesn't, the argument is the true price discovery has to continue until that equilibrium is found or met.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what I appreciate with what you said there is that you've broken it down very neatly and very simply. And what I mean by that is it's what I like to call economics 101, is that it is supply and demand. That it is as simple as that. And it's not just silver, it could be insert any other commodity here if there's a structural, challenge, or it doesn't even have to be a commodity. If there's an issue with supply and demand, again, that will have to sort itself out. And as you said, in terms of true price discovery, Paul, while I'm thinking on it, and this might come across as a rookie question, but I understand that we get a lot of people with different levels of interest and knowledge about commodities listening to this. Some people will look at the Western price, dare I say, of silver, and then they'll look at the price in Shanghai, and they'll notice there's actually a big difference there. Could you just explain why that difference occurs, just for people that might not be aware, why there are effectively two prices, one for the West, one for the East?
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, to be honest, it's a really great question because for me, there's been a lot of misunderstanding of what this arbitrage means, why it's happening. And, a lot of it is presented by people in the West some people who are trying to convince us that China's silver supply is on the ropes, the West, the United States is controlling the markets, and this arbitrage reflects this complete chaos that reigns in China's silver market. Now, the answer to that in reality is absolutely not. And I'll explain why, because if you go back to 2016, I mean, I'd explained this previous to that, but I put an article on our own website and explained how China would, excuse me, deliberately create an arbitrage opportunity of substance when they perceived the West was drained of metal,
Mhm.
which kind of ties in with what we've just said previously. Now, the argument for that, therefore, is because you create the arbitrage, you'll squeeze even more silver out the West. And therefore, that's always been their intention because China, in effect, is laying down the gauntlet to the COMEX and the LBMA, saying, well, you either adopt a one for one basis in terms of a contract. I know contracts aren't 1 ounce, but 1 ounce means 1 ounce. Or
Mhm.
we're going to take a dominant position in gold and silver markets. We want to price silver and gold in the yuan and not in dollars anymore. So it's a natural sort of part of what I've called, it's not time driven, it's event driven, where China would implement these arbitrage opportunities to put the final squeeze on the Western markets. And that's exactly what's happening. So the arbitrage is really dangling a carrot to those in the West and saying to them, well, you can sell to us for an extra 12, $15. Okay, you've got to ship the shipping costs and all that. So it's not 12 to 15 in reality. Or you can buy in the West if you can get hold of it and sell it to us on the basis of making a profit. If
Yeah.
that's what you want to do, you're just there to make some money, repeat and rinse. So that's the basis for having the arbitrage. It's not anything to do with China's market per se. But what I would say is with China is because their contracts are one for one, there's no paper arbitrage in paper sort of sorry shenanigans with regards to how many ounces of physical do we have compared to the notional contracts. There is, and they will work on true supply and demand. Now, the demand for silver is enormous in China, not just in industrial terms, but I'm even getting stories now from people who are in Hong Kong and China telling me that Chinese citizens are buying physical silver in large quantity. There was a situation, excuse me, where someone in Hong Kong was telling me that all the silver was cleared out. There was none left. So this is very unusual, but of course it adds to the physical shortages. But what do you want to do if you think, well, we've got a bit of a shortage ourselves in some capacity? Well, that's a good way to create an arbitrage to drag more of the silver from the west to the east. So that's the rationale behind it. It's really not complicated. It's not because China's silver market's in serious trouble or anything like that. It's just a way, and China's been doing this, bear in mind, for years, is buying up every ounce of silver they could get their hands on. They've also got a strategic reserve that's a matter of national security that they don't want to touch unless it's a dire emergency. How big that is, nobody knows. I would speculate, and I am speculating, it could be 100,000 to 150,000 um, tons of silver, which is significant. It might be even bigger. It might not be as big as that. I don't know, but it's significant. That much we do know, but it's a matter of national security, so you can't put figures on it. But that, in essence, is what all China's trying to do. They're just trying to suck as much metal out the West as possible. And there's other prongs to this. The export restrictions or ban that we mentioned a few minutes ago that started on the 1st of January. The other thing is this enormous amounts of investors standing for delivery in the COMEX. I wonder how much of that is Chinese investors wanting to stand for delivery. Again, it's a mechanism just to squeeze the West. And this is why we're hearing from certain people in the West trying to claim it's the other way around. It's not. It absolutely isn't. China's squeezing the West. It's China's squeezing the West with rare earths, with gallium, germanium.
Mm.
They're also doing it with gold to some extent, but now they're particularly doing it with silver.
Yes, well, to me, it always seems like they are one step ahead of the game. I always like to say, and not that we're here to talk about politics in this episode, but I always like to compare the Chinese methodology to the Western methodology and just say because of the way that they are set up politically, that the Chinese are able to play chess and everyone else seems to be playing checkers or draft, depending on what part of the world you're from. And I think that makes a big difference when it comes to creating these strategic reserves, as you mentioned, and you're able to plan for the long term rather than, oh, I've got to plan for the next 2 years. I think that makes a massive difference as well.
Well, yes, because well, look, here's the point. If I mean, there's me posting something in, what was it, September 2016 about their strategy and what they intended doing. And that's playing out now. So you can see China has long-term strategies. Now, maybe it's only a few lines. I'll just read out what I posted. And
Mhm.
I mentioned gold, but this also applied to silver. And what I said was there will come a point in time when the supply from the West will dry up in entirety. Once China deems that point in time has arrived, it will then raise the price in Shanghai to create an arbitrage between itself and London and New York. If managed correctly, this would then create the supply again, enabling China to drain the West of further gold and silver, who would take advantage of this price differential between, obviously, London, New York, and Shanghai, which would place an intolerable strikes in the LBMA. And I said this course of action would also enable Shanghai to find true price discovery that, basically gold, silver enthusiasts such as this author, meaning me, have been demanding for years. And so that was a known strategy. I knew it was coming because I was told by the Chinese that was the intended strategy. And
Mhm.
here we are in 2026. It's not quite 10 years, but I mean, I knew it back in 2013, 14. So they just bided their time. But in the meantime, of course, they've been not only acquiring as much physical silver, but they've bought silver or silver derivative mining operations all over the world. And I know this as well because when we went round starting to try and look for silver properties, or silver derivatives, meaning, it was a copper zinc mine, practically everywhere we went is, China's already bought this.
Wow.
And this was, globally. I mean, there was a lot of it in South America, for example, but not entirely. So China had a long-term view where they knew how important silver would be as an industrial metal, and therefore, they took the appropriate course of action, which, reaped dividends and benefits for them.
Well, yeah, 100%. It's amazing that you wrote that post in 2016. You could have equally written that in 2025, and it's it's played out absolutely perfectly. Paul, I think in terms of silver, just to summarize silver before we talk about gold. So in effect, people will see two different prices. One Western price, one Eastern price, and the reason for that is arbitrage-related activities, as you've just clearly mentioned. And ultimately, with silver, we are in a period of true price discovery because we have a severe imbalance between supply and demand, which certainly from my research is highly unlikely to change anytime soon. But as always, people, please do read the disclaimer. This is just for educational purposes only. Before we pop on to gold, is there anything else you'd like to bring to the listeners' attention about silver, or should we go on to gold?
No, I think that we, more or less encapsulates in a broad sense where we are, why we are where we are, and why things are different. The only thing I would add to it is, if people are, selling you their belief on where silver goes, excuse me, using charts, then it's meaningless. And I can't be any more blunt than that. It is meaningless because it doesn't apply to physical reality. Otherwise, as I always say, show me one person who showed you a chart that told you silver was going to $110 an ounce on the 26th of January 2026. And the simple answer is no one. And the reason there's no one is because no one could have predicted this. So if all these charts were so accurate, why did they never predict it? The other thing is I get on people going, well, there's these cup and handles from 40 years ago. I'm like, what? What? So you're telling me that we can predict what the price of silver was going to be decades later based on some TA that said, oh, at that point, the world's going to suddenly decide that we're going to have this paper explosion in silver. It's just a coincidence. It's a coincidence that silver has reached the point where the physical supply demand is so acute. That's why it's happened. Otherwise, if it hadn't happened this year, it might not have happened for 10 years. So what? They just stretch the cup and handle out another 5 or 10 years and go, oh, look, it worked then. For me, it's always been this very convenient way to justify and get people to believe in what someone wants to see happen because, their trading position or their investment position means I want this to go higher or I want this to go lower. And they want to convince other people and then try and momentum trade that position. But, I'm not being rude, but there isn't anyone in social media who is going to drive the price of gold and silver themselves. It's not going to happen. Because the real markets that drive the price dwarf anything they can comprehend. It's like retail thinks, oh, well, I can go and buy my 50 ounces of silver thinking that's going to make any difference. That's not even a drop in a gallon bucket. If you bought 100,000 ounces, it wouldn't even be a drop in a bucket. Retail with all due respect, is irrelevant to the price dynamic now. To those people who think, well, I'm going to go out and buy all this physical and I'm going to stick it to the bullion banks and screw them over. It's not going to make any difference. To the opaque markets where the tonnage is enormous, that's traded annually and year after year, that you have no visibility of data wise, that's what drives the price now, not anything else. Hence why you're talking about situations where if the COMEX suddenly has 45 million ounces one month, 35 million ounces the previous month, that's 80 million ounces. That's again significant, but it's not the whole story. But it all adds up, and when you have the major players, will then be the ones that influence the price, not retail.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I think that people, as you say, might not be able to comprehend. And as I mentioned, yeah, everyone should go and please, go and read that disclaimer, but also understand that if you're looking to, purchase physical silver and so forth, in my opinion, you should understand two things. Number one is that the supply and demand difference. And again, that is a structural thing. As you mentioned, it's been 5 years already. It's likely, I imagine that's going to continue as well. So the simple supply and demand alone will tell you that, again, that price should, that's not, not 100% certain, but that price point should go a lot higher just based on that. And ultimately, if you're looking to get out of the system and have physical metals, gold, silver, etc., again, do it and do it because you understand why you're doing it. Don't just do it because we're talking about it. For example, always do your own homework and research on that. That disclaimer being said, Paul, let's pop over to gold if we can. And
Mhm.
gold is surging for, it's fair to say, slightly different reasons. Now, you don't have to go over the fundamentals again if you don't want to. I think everyone's discussed them ad nauseum. Uh, but I want to bring to people's attention a video that you posted. I think it was a video, it could have been a post. Now, this is about Russia tokenizing gold. This has taken a lot of people by surprise. Um, I only heard about it because we were talking about it off air. So, what's going on over in Russia, and why is this story so important?
Right. Yeah. The issue of tokenization first came to my notice when its state-owned bank, Sberbank, which think now it's called just Spur, began issuing digital gold assets in late 2022. Now, what that means is those tokens are backed by physical gold. They're obviously stored in vaults, and really it was part of a broader measure for Russia to bypass sanctions, basically. So you could use what are termed DFAs or digital financial assets for international settlements. And of course, you can bypass traditional uh, financial payment systems such as SWIFT, which of course Russia is barred from using anyway.
Mhm.
So, as I say, the primary purpose is you have this mechanism for cross-border payments, which are sanction proof and don't rely, excuse me, on the usage of the US dollar. So, when they first tokenized gold back in December 2022, Spur used these blockchain-based tokens, and they were obviously correlated to gold prices. Now, if you fast forward to the beginning of 2025, Russia had been testing these so-called digital financial assets with a number of countries, ironically, in the Middle East.
Mhm.
We didn't divulge who they were for obvious reasons, because then they might be the United States might get rather angry with them. But I think it would be fair to say it's probably the Saudis, the UAE, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, with regards to tokenization, that therefore provides a lot more domestic liquidity, and it allows the Russian central bank obviously to use gold for financial operations, and correspondingly, it helps to give support to the ruble. Although, ironically, the ruble was the best performing currency in 2025. So, obviously, this is an ongoing process. The Bank of Russia wants to obviously provide and ensure the legal framework's watertight, so you can have tokenized assets, integrate them into the financial system. And therefore, what that allows you to do, and it was as much as anything because the West, or the United States and Europe and the UK principally, put these massive sanctions on Russia, including, obviously, as we know, freezing their assets and freezing the operations of their central bank internationally.
Mhm.
But what it would allow them to do is to create these digital assets that are tradable, backed by physical gold reserves, and you can do it internationally with anyone. So it was a method of payment, and obviously to bypass sanctions. Now, obviously, the interesting aspect to this, it largely did go under the radar. Not many people were aware of it, to be brutally honest. I kind of stumbled upon it because I was just trying to find out if there was any recent developments going on in the gold space in Russia, and I just happened to stumble upon it. And I discussed it with my own podcast subscribers. That's not YouTube, by the way. And then I kind of, just before the back end of last year, I suddenly thought, well, we wanted to keep putting some stuff out on YouTube so we didn't go quiet for weeks on end.
Mhm.
And I recorded something and thought, oh, hang on, that's quite an interesting one, because it's got some current context, but also, of course, some historical perspective. But it's now, of course, being extended to companies in Russia, so they can settle accounts with foreign partners. So maybe we could bore people a bit with how it works, what the mechanism is. So you issue a token, the value of which, of course, as we just said, is tied to the price of gold. And that's confirmed by you pledging a gold bar, and then you can transfer the token to a foreign counterparty. And then you can pay for goods and services instead of utilizing traditional currency.
Hmm.
And when you have the receipt of those gold digital financial assets, then the seller can either exchange them for physical gold or its monetary equivalent. And the digital asset that's received, therefore, by the counterparty can be transferred, ironically, to others in a settlement chain. So, therefore, you can use the token to pay for goods and services from other suppliers. So, it gives it huge flexibility. And, it's something, one of those cases of necessity is the mother of invention. And for the Russians, it was a very good way of them to be able to trade with global partners out of the purview, of course, of the United States and Europe, etc., but more the US than anyone else. And I would imagine it's being utilized far more than conventional wisdom would suggest. There's no way, of course, of tracking who's using it, but that's the whole point of it.
Hmm.
It's to keep the trade under the radar so no one's actually aware it's happening. But it's a very, very clever way of internationalizing trade. But again, we're back to that perspective of having international trade with that is effectively backed by gold. Meaning, let me explain that because that might confuse people. What I'm saying by that is in the future, you can have, say, a trade relationship between two countries, and if one country has a trade surplus, then with that other country, they can settle it potentially in gold, or they can settle it if they're using local currencies and use that local currency to buy goods and services, additional ones in that country. So, in Russia's case, that could be Russia. I mean, not China, but we'll use that as an example.
Hmm.
That's how it works. It's very simple, it's very effective, but it again shows why gold will be an important component in the settlement of international trade, should I say.
Do you think that the US will likely return to a gold standard anytime soon, or not? It couldn't. Yeah, it might not just be the USA. It could be insert any other country here. Do you think that? 'Cause a lot of people like to talk about it, but then do you think, in your opinion, that's likely or unlikely to happen, and why?
Well, here's the question before we can maybe attempt to answer it, because there's a lot of speculation, and I think a lot of this comes out of the fact, for me, there's conflated stories that suggest the United States is going to reprice the gold, which frankly it doesn't have. But let's just assume the United States has this gold, although, as I said, it doesn't to a large extent. But there's this, and to be honest, let's assess what that would mean in reality.
Mhm.
Because if the United States was, just for argument's sake, to reprice gold to $10,000 an ounce, because I've heard figures like that bandied around. Okay, what would that mean? It would immediately tell the world, do not trade with the dollar anymore. The dollar would be toast. Now, given the United States seems to have spent decades trying to prevent other nations trading in non-dollar terms,
Mhm.
including sanctions, including color revolutions and assassinating leaders, why would they suddenly decide, I know, let's just tell the world who's de-dollarizing anyway and we're really not happy about this? Well, now we've repriced gold to $10,000 an ounce. We're telling you that dollars is toast and therefore don't use it anymore. There's no logic to that. The other problem you would have in doing this is one thing for the United States to go, we've got 8,132 tons or whatever it is. Well, the world's going to go, prove it. And we've constantly heard all these statements. We're going to see an audit of Fort Knox. I mean, it even cropped up very briefly in during the early stages of Trump's presidency 2.0.
Mhm.
But you notice it very quickly died and no one talks about it anymore. I mean, and we haven't had an audit there since 19, I think 1953. Forgive me
Mhm.
if I'm a bit suspicious, but I always go back to matters like when the Germans wanted their gold back, and oh, you can't have it for years. And then when they got the gold back, it wasn't even didn't even match up with the serial numbers of the gold that they deposited in the United States. So, you know, you have to be very skeptical. And if the United States refuses to prove that it has the gold, is anyone going to trust them and believe them? And if they subsequently did have an audit and it's not there, I mean, their credibility is gone totally.
Mm.
That's a hell of a gamble. So, what's the benefit of the United States doing this? And people go, well, because they want to devalue their currency, because this is part of the US is this idea, well, they'll devalue their currency. Well, if they're still a massive importer, which they are, what's going to happen if they devalue their currency? Well, you're going to have price inflation like you can't believe. So why would they want to do that at this point in time? If they were a major exporter, which they're a million years away, well, I grossly exaggerate, they're decades away from achieving that as things stand. Well, therefore, why would you want to do any of this? Why are you effectively going to tell the world the dollar as a world reserve currency is over? Bretton Woods is dead and buried. We're no longer an hegemonic power. When the United States seems to be doing everything it can to try and convince a disbelieving world that it is an hegemonic power. And that's why, for me, anything's possible. I mean, but rather than saying, well, they can do this, yes, very easily, what is the outcome of doing this? And I don't see, from my perspective, how that at all is beneficial to the US to do it on that basis. In fact, it's a suicide mission. So why would they do it? And I can't see how or why. And what's the benefit? There is no intrinsic benefit at this point in time.
Paul, I know you said that you don't do price predictions, and I'm not going to ask you for one. And also, the supply and demand is in gold is, there's not, as far as I'm aware, there's not a severity in terms of, what silver is like as well. Are there any other things that people just need to, pay attention to with regards to gold? Obviously, Poland buying 150 tons, I think I read that a little while ago. Their central bank continues to buy. You've just outlined why it wouldn't make sense for the US to go down, that route of revaluing and things like that. Well, that makes sense to me as well. And there's anything that people need to pay attention to with regards to gold moving forward.
Well, yeah, I mean, gold's not $5,000 an ounce for no reason. I mean, gold's different. I know people will like to refer to silver as a monetary metal as well as an industrial metal. And historically, that's absolutely true. I think for retail, they see it as a monetary metal. There's a lot of rumors that, central banks globally have been buying silver, but I think they're buying silver like China's buy silver, which is as a strategic reserve for industrial purposes. Does it mean that in the future silver might not become a monetary metal again? Possibly, but as things stand, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of evidence to support that. Of course, that could change. Gold, there's a lot of emphasis, and the Chinese have said it so many times, very subtly, that gold will be an important component in a future financial system. I've talked about the settlement of international trade using gold. There's no doubt part of the reason why intelligent nations are buying gold. Fiat currencies are coming to their natural end of cycle usage. They know that financial systems are in big trouble. We got enormous problems with debt. We're likely to see Western countries printing into oblivion in the not too distant future
Mhm.
to plug gaps here and everywhere. So the case for gold as a monetary metal is self-evident. De-dollarization as well, where we've moved away from the US dollar, US Treasury complex as a reserve asset. We've now moved gold being adopted. That's irrefutably the case, where nations have been dumping US Treasuries and buying physical gold. So the case for gold in that sense is very clear. I mean, gold, as I say, at $5,000 an ounce, to me, the only thing I would say that has surprised me about this is that we got this far and there hasn't been a major schism in the Western financial system, etc. I was quite surprised we got to 5,000 in one sense without a lot of other things happening, including huge institutional interest. The institutional interest is still pretty small, but for sovereign nations, there is enormous amounts of interest. And this comes back to again what we're officially told China buys and what China has been buying are two radically different things. Now, I spoke for years and over a decade that China had 40,000 tons of gold. And that is not what I've had with people now. Interesting, there was a Chinese commentator a few days ago who referenced in a sort of indirect way China having 50,000 tons, which I'm not saying is the case, but if they had 40,000 over a decade ago, and bear in mind they don't export any of the gold they produce, then that's not unreasonable to come to that conclusion that that is indeed the case. So there is a lot of compelling reasons why gold it makes sense for nations to hold gold. Yeah, I often get asked about the price. Look, I'll put it this way. This is how gold, well, in my head works. It works differently for different people. And I have used this example before, but let's use, because the housing market in Western countries is massively inflated in price terms.
Mhm.
Ridiculous. So let's assume a house, and I'm going to use some simple maths. So this is not an average house price, but let's just work on the basis because gold's $5,000 an ounce. So it's very convenient to say, well, imagine in the current world buying a house for $500,000, which
Mhm.
is completely overinflated price wise, but that would cost you obviously 1,000 ounces of gold as on based on now hang on 100 ounces of gold in G.
Mhm.
Got the maths right. So on that basis, you that's what you would pay currently. Now, for me, that's a clear indication that the house price is way too high, or the argument, the flip side could be the gold price is too low.
Mhm.
In terms of saying, when am I going to exchange my physical gold and start to buy assets in a world where true price discovery exists? Now, let's just say, for argument's sake, that gold is stays at $5,000 an ounce, but the housing prices fall 50%.
Mhm.
And therefore, on that basis, you can then buy the house for $250,000. Therefore, you then can buy the house in purchasing power terms for 50 ounces of gold. Now, let's just assume on the basis that the housing prices fall 50%, but let's say gold goes to $10,000 an ounce. This is all, by the way, just speculation to illustrate a point. I'm not dropping subtle hints. I've had people going, are you dropping subtle hints about prices? No, I'm not. I'm just using this to illustrate a point. So if gold's at $10,000 an ounce, and the house costs $250,000, then quite obviously that you're going to have to pay 25 or buy the house with 25 ounces of gold.
Mhm.
Now, on that basis, if we go from what it is now to what it is then, that is when you start to see purchasing power in having the gold. So for me, the price of gold is not relevant. What's relevant is if I want to come to a point in the future and buy physical assets again, then what price would I determine that gold or the gold price was fair value to buy those assets? And at
Mhm.
some point in the future, that's going to happen. That doesn't put a price on gold. That is the ratio between what the price is you would pay for assets now that are completely in a bubble versus what you would pay for in a world where those assets aren't in a bubble anymore. So that's the basis, and you can play around with those figures and you determine what you think is fair value. Now, obviously, equally, there is a school of thought that says, well, asset prices might not fall because it will blow everything up, which is true. But
Mhm.
then if asset prices don't fall, then gold has to move correspondingly to reflect that. So there are many permutations to this. But I'm not personally and never have been interested in going, well, I bought some gold and now the price is this. And therefore I've accumulated this fiat profit because I'm not interested in buying gold for fiat profit or for that matter silver for fiat profit. It's about its purchasing power in the future based on what will happen to asset prices in a non-financialized world. And, that is the basis, I think, on which to try and derive some estimates. But there's a lot to go. There's a lot of water under the bridge in terms of where we go with this. As I said, I'm surprised we got to 5,000 and everything's still, in inverted commas, relatively calm.
Mm.
And a lot of people don't see any problems at all. But they should be asking themselves, why the hell is gold at 5,000 an ounce? You know, and I mean, where might it be in a year or two's time? I don't know. I mean, I'm not again here to make predictions, but I think it's very telling. The case for gold is growing, and when the dollar ceases to be the reserve asset increasingly, and gold is, that is a big indication that gold is going to play a very important part in the future financial system. Now, does that mean we return to a gold standard or some quasi gold standard? That remains to be seen. But I come back to my point with the Chinese. The Chinese have made it clear you can settle uh, in international trade. Either you can be in receipt of yuan or you can be in receipt of gold. So if it's fully convertible to gold, then in international trade terms, the yuan is backed by gold. It's completely gone over most people's heads, and nobody even talks about it. But that's what they said, and that's absolutely the case. So this is why increasingly countries are lining up to utilize the yuan because they're going, well, we have the fallback that if we trade with you and we have a surplus, we can always convert the yuan into gold, and it's not a fixed price. It's a floating price, which is even a better deal for those who want to utilize the yuan, and that's why it'll be very interesting when the figure for SIPS comes out for 2025. I don't know what that figure is going to be it was nearly 25 trillion in yuan terms. So we'll see what that sort of no 25 sorry trillion in dollar terms. In yuan terms, I think it was about 150 160 trillion yuan. So let's see what it is for 2025, because bear in mind that's all in non-dollar terms,
Mm.
and it's all in yuan terms. So as an international currency, the yuan's adoption is growing hugely on a year by year basis. But we'll see what the data is for 2025, I guess, maybe in the next couple of months, something like that.
Well, Paul, I think that's again another excellent summary, and you've explained things thoroughly. I think that everyone could come away today with a lot of food for thought. Obviously, we've gone through silver. Obviously, that's got a lot of different dynamics than gold. So, gold and silver are different in a lot of ways. And I just want to thank you for bringing, a couple of, especially that tokenized Russian gold story to everyone's attention as well. Uh, I know that we spoke briefly off air, and you wanted to mention again briefly, wanted to mention that overall, the overarching thing is that we are in a resource war, and we could be talking about, oil, germanium, gold, silver, whatever element you want to. So if you can, before we sign off, just again, the overarching 30,000 foot view of the ongoing or the start of this resource war that we're facing.
Yeah, there's clearly a resource war that's going on between the United States and China. And I'll just give some brief examples. The reason the United States wanted to seize control of Venezuela's was the oil reserves. The question of 300 billion barrels is very highly questionable, but they have sizable reserves. That much is true. And the US wanted it because they didn't want China having access to it, because China was Venezuela's biggest oil uh, export market. That's one point. Another point with regards to this was that the United States uh, was keen to obviously get hold of Greenland. And is it for military purposes? It doesn't make any sense. I don't know anyone who buys that. Again, it's this promise of huge resources that they don't want the Chinese to get hold of because China's already got a footprint to some extent in Greenland.
Mhm.
That's another example. We have the situation where the United States, well, is teetering on the edge of going to war potentially with Iran. Why does he want to do that? He wants to seize control of Iran's resources, but as much as anything, he doesn't want China getting access. Why? Because China import enormous amounts of Iranian oil, as one example. There's the situation where China has a significant footprint in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and amongst other things, China gets huge amounts of copper from there. And what did the United States do? Went and signed this agreement in the back end of 2025 and said to the Congolese, we don't want you trading with the Chinese anymore. Don't sign any new agreements for any resources, etc. So again, just trying to squeeze China out. Ukraine's pretty much the same. The US, how much resources are there and whether an ounce of anything ever gets extracted is highly debatable.
Mhm.
But part of the reason is the United States wanted control of it because they didn't want, well, the Chinese and the Russians having access to it. But principally because China's the one with the money, China's the one who'll stump up the costs, China's the one who reaps the benefits. So there's clearly an attempt by the US to squeeze China. We know the United States was trying to squeeze China over semiconductors. They tried to crush Huawei. This is all factually known to be true. And the flip side is China is obviously put rare earth restrictions on the military, which is crippling the United States' capability to arm the Ukrainians, although they've kind of largely given up, although they're sort of arming them anyway by selling arms to the Europeans.
Mhm.
But the cupboard's bare in that respect. It's also made the United States launching offensives against the Iranians problematic. They haven't been able to replenish Israel's stock from when they had the 12-day Iran-Israel war in the summer of 2025. So there are huge problematic issues. They're even now putting restrictions on the commercial use of rare earths, but they also put restrictions on and bans on germanium and gallium. Now,
Mhm.
if you go to our YouTube channel, I put out a clip all about gallium. You should listen to it because gallium's more of a serious problem for the US than even rare earths. And now we just talked about the export ban on silver. I think that's as more as than anything is trying to cripple the West, including the United States, is access to it. So there is very clearly this resource war going on between the two countries. Other countries, of course, are involved. There's all the issue of supply chains. And that's because the United States has finally realized something. And not that the rest of the world's interested in being an hegemonic dominant power, because they're not, and that includes the Chinese. But it's those nations who have the resources or access to the resources that are the nations that will be in dominant in inverted commas powers in the future. If you don't have those, you're going to be an also ran in world affairs. There is no military power in the future. This is just nonsense talk. And the US has finally realized this with respect that it can't defeat China militarily, it can't defeat them economically or financially. The only way it thinks it can do anything is trying to put the skids on China having access to resources globally, which is a flawed plan that won't work either. But that's the fundamental shift. It's a world of resources in the future. It's not a world of military dominance and power because those days have gone, and principally because what's the natural outcome of that? World War III, what does that mean? The planet's destroyed. No one wants the planet to be destroyed, despite some people believing there are elements who do. I'm sorry, that's just utter nonsense.
Well, Paul, again, thank you for the excellent summary. I think there's a lot of food for thought. And what I would suggest to people is to, there's a lot of news out there. There's a lot of, buoyancy with, relevant commodity markets. When you can, just try and take a step back, take a deep breath, and try and take a 30,000-foot view of what's going on. Think about what everything that Paul said today with regards to supply and demand. And, again, hopefully that will help to give you clarity moving forward if it comes down to looking positioning your portfolio, for example, or just from a day-to-day point of view. Paul, I always like to give people the opportunity to say how they can be found, and I'll put these links into the show notes. So if people want to find out more about your work and get in touch, how do they do that?
Yeah, so we've effectively got a number of mechanisms to contact us. There's obviously the website, thesiriusreport.com. You can subscribe to our content, which is unique for subscribers. It's dirt cheap. You can buy the cheapest option at $4.75 a month. And we spent years telling you things that are all going to happen in the future, what's relevant and important now that is largely overlooked. So subscribers would have known everything what we predicted years ago with regards to silver as one example. If you subscribe annually, you can get a month free as well. And we cover different stuff all the time. We don't repeat ourselves. We do some topical stuff because we have to be more reactive to that now, but also things like the Russian tokenization, which hardly anyone else has even talked about or is even aware of. As one example, the other thing you can do is you can subscribe to us on Substack, where on Substack, instead of having the audio podcast, you get a cut down transcript, which is very quick to read and has all the important facts in it. Because some people said I haven't got time to listen. Fair enough. So you can subscribe on Substack on that basis. That if you don't want to subscribe, then in the context of paying, you can subscribe and support us on YouTube, which we greatly appreciated. I think we just crossed 20,000 subscribers, which we're quite pleased about. Although the one thing we found interesting is the amount of people on X who will refuse to use YouTube.
Hmm.
So, okay, that is what it is. But so we put lots of content out on YouTube. I think we've had 400 videos now. I can't believe we'd actually done that many. But so you can follow us there. We're obviously very prominent on X as well. So they're the sort of mechanisms by which you can support what we do. If you want to, obviously you can contact us via the website as well if you want to ask any questions. And we appreciate all the support we get because we're just trying to constantly grow the channel and grow people's perspective on what we believe to be the reality of the world we live in.
As mentioned, Paul, I will put all of those links into the notes that come with this podcast and video as well. Thanks for your time again today. Plenty for people to go away and think about, and look forward to speaking again later on in 2026.
Yeah, and thanks very much for having me on. Much appreciated.